Today is March 20th, 2025. Combat operations continue all along the line of contact in Ukraine between Russian and Ukrainian forces. This follows a phone call between US President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin. Russia agreed, in theory, to a 30-day ceasefire against targets, energy targets, or maybe energy and infrastructure targets. Either way, Russia has decimated targets of this nature already, and they carry out large-scale missile and drone strikes, sometimes more often, but usually once a month. So a 30-day ceasefire on a range of targets that have already been decimated and are only attacked in large waves once a month really is not a concession at all. And this is Russia's way of appearing to go along with this process while avoiding a Minsk-style ceasefire being imposed upon them, and then a Syria-style buffer zone being created within Ukraine to essentially freeze the conflict and allow the United States and its European proxies to reorganize, rearm, reconstitute Ukraine's military forces and prepare for the next round of hostilities that will inevitably unfold in the future, as the US and Europe have done repeatedly to Russia since the end of the Cold War. And as a matter of fact, I'm going to go over all of this in detail. I want to lay out an argument that weighs both precedent and evidence that the US has demonstrated a pattern of posing false peace to Russia to buy it time when it reaches an impasse, and its unswerving desire to encircle, contain, and eventually absorb Russia, and then again as part of a much wider agenda to encircle and contain China as well, and then of course everyone in between, including nations like Iran. And we can already see the current Trump administration working on Iran. That is bombing Yemen right now as I speak. They continue carrying out military operations against Yemen, and they are openly threatening war with Iran. And this is a continuation of the Biden administration's military aggression all across the Middle East. And this is all about eliminating Iran to further isolate both Russia and China. All of these conflicts are connected. I would like to also point out that Tulsi Gabbard, who is the National Intelligence Director now in the Trump administration, she is openly supporting and backing this war against Yemen, and she is calling on other nations in the region to participate in it. So for those who were telling me that I should not worry about Marco Rubio, Pete Hegseth, John Radcliffe, Mike Waltz, all of these warmongering neocons being incorporated into the Trump administration because Tulsi Gabbard would be a counterweight to them. Well, it turns out she didn't transform all of these neocons into peacemakers. They have turned her into an unbridled neocon, if she wasn't already one to begin with. With that in mind, let's begin by looking at the situation on the ground. This is the situation in Ukraine according to a pro-Ukrainian live map, liveuamap.com. And if we look along the line of contact, we will see all of these red rifle icons indicate Russian troops on the offensive all along the line of contact, enlarging the size of these salients, wrapping around heavily fortified positions like Pokrovsk and Toretsk and Seversk here, and Kupiansk, and of course the collapse of Ukraine's military operations in Kursk. So there was this incursion by Ukrainian forces from Sumy into Kursk, Russia, and it has fully and completely collapsed. And to demonstrate this, we'll just show you what it looked like as of January 1st this year. And now March 20th. So you could see the significant collapse that has taken place, even according to a pro-Ukrainian map. Now, I want to go over this article very quickly regarding the fighting in Kursk. It was pointed out by Alexander Mikuris of the Duran during one of his recent video updates. He covered this article, and I think that it summarizes the situation not only in Kursk very well, but the overall inevitable collapse of Ukraine's fighting capacity in general. And so it says, everything is finished. Ukrainian troops relive retreat from Kursk. So this is indisputable. This has happened. It has ended, and it has ended in disaster for Ukraine. And there's no one disputing that, not even British state media. And in this article, it talks about how comprehensively Russia has defeated this incursion into Kursk and how badly outfought Ukraine is in every conceivable way. Ukrainian soldiers fighting in Russia's Kursk region have described scenes like a horror movie as they retreated from the front lines. The BBC has received extensive accounts from Ukrainian troops who recount a catastrophic withdrawal in the face of heavy fire and columns of military equipment destroyed and constant attacks from swarms of Russian drones. Ukrainian troops are trying to leave columns of troops and equipment. Some of them are burned by Russian drones on the road. It is impossible to leave during the day. Movements of men, logistics, and equipment have been reliant on one major route between Sudzha and Ukraine's Sumy region. Sudzha is the one population center that Ukraine did manage to seize over all of these months and hold onto, and now they have been pushed entirely out of it. So they're talking to these Ukrainian soldiers who are contradicting reports coming out of Kiev itself, claiming that this was an orderly retreat and they've achieved all of their objectives. No, it was a complete collapse and a total rout. And that is what the Ukrainian troops involved in it are saying themselves. And this is the Western media admitting all of this. They said traveling on this road was possible and it was relatively safe a month ago, but by the 9th of March, it was all under the fire control of the enemy. Drones around the clock. In 1 minute, you can see 2 or 3 drones. That's a lot. They said, we have all the logistics here on one Sudzha-Sumy highway, and everyone knew the Russians would try to cut it. But this again came as a surprise to our command. At the time of writing, this was 3 days ago by the BBC, just before Russia retook Sudzha, this Ukrainian that they're citing said Ukrainian forces were being pressed from 3 sides. So not quite an encirclement, but they were being pushed from 3 sides. And then the road that they had to travel on to get out was under the fire control of Russian. So it's not as if Russian troops had surrounded them. They were surrounded on 3 sides by Russian troops, plus fire control on this road that they were using to retreat. So it is a semi-encirclement, or you could say an operational encirclement. The situation on that day, 11th of March, was described as catastrophic. This other soldier who spoke to the BBC was serving in the headquarters for the Kursk front. He too highlighted the damage caused by Russian FPV drones. We used to have an advantage in drones, now we do not, he said. He added that Russia had an advantage with more accurate airstrikes and greater number of troops. So we're always hearing about how Russia is losing more troops than Ukraine. Whether that's true or not, it's irrelevant. They still have many more troops to the point where it is making a significant strategic difference on the battlefield. Supply routes had been cut, logistics no longer worked, organized deliveries of weapons, ammunition, food, and water were no longer possible. They managed to leave Sudzha by foot at night. We almost died several times. Drones are in the sky all the time, day and night. The soldier predicted Ukraine's entire foothold in Kursk would be lost, but that from a military point of view, the Kursk direction had exhausted itself. There is no point in keeping it anymore, and I would argue there is no point in creating it in the first place. And I warned, as soon as Ukrainian forces went into Kursk, that all it would do is overextend the rest of the line of contact. That is exactly what it has done. It has caused collapses all along the line of contact, and it will contribute to the overall collapse of Ukraine's fighting capacity inevitably if this conflict continues. And this is the reason I'm reading this to you from the BBC. This is the reason the US is desperately seeking a ceasefire. They do not want peace. They have never wanted peace. The US will never, as long as the system that controls the United States, including the current administration, which is a part of that system, they will always pick primacy over peace. Any overture of peace is just a means of buying time when reaching an impasse, to buy time, to reorganize, and relaunch hostilities when factors tilt back in their favor. Western officials estimate that Ukraine's Kursk offensive involved about 12,000 troops. They were some of the best trained soldiers equipped with Western supplied weapons, including tanks and armored vehicles. So the best men, the best equipment Ukraine had, they fed it into Kursk, and it has been all destroyed and now routed. And if that was the best of what they had, what they have left, how is that going to fare in the weeks and months ahead as Russia continues pushing forward on the battlefield along the line of contact? This was a point that I had been making all along, that this was only going to accelerate the collapse of Ukraine's fighting capacity, and now we see the BBC essentially admitting that this is what's happening. And the BBC article concludes by saying Ukraine's top general, Alexander Syrsky, insists that Ukrainian forces have pulled back to more favorable positions, remain in Kursk, and would do so for as long as it is expedient and necessary. Any hopes that Ukraine would be able to trade Kursk territory for some of its own have significantly diminished. And myself and many other analysts pointed out that Russia would never trade anything for Kursk. They would take it back by force. That was always a given. Last week, President Vladimir Zelensky said he believed the Kursk operation had accomplished its task by forcing Russia to pull troops from the east and relieve pressure on Pokrovsk. But it's not yet clear at what cost, and it is actually clear that this did not work. Pokrovsk's position has been continuously compromised all throughout the Kursk operation. As a matter of fact, Russia made most of its progress in advancing toward and encircling Pokrovsk because Ukrainian lines were overextended, because they drew off their best equipment and men to go into Kursk. So an absolute complete disaster, and a microcosm of what is taking place across the entire battlefield. And again, this ties in directly to this urgency we see in Washington and also across Europe to achieve a ceasefire and to freeze the conflict, not end it. They have no intention at all whatsoever of ending it. If President Trump wanted to end the conflict in Ukraine, he could have actually announced policies the very first day he was in office to do so. He has already demonstrated the ability, at least in principle, to cut Ukraine off completely from all military support. That goes for weapons, ammunition, intelligence sharing, maintenance, absolutely everything, training. All of this can be cut at any time of President Trump's choosing. He is choosing to continue what is a U.S. proxy war against Russia. This is not a war between Ukraine and Russia. This is a U.S. proxy war with Russia, using Ukraine as a battering ram that the U.S. itself prepared ahead of time specifically for this purpose. And this includes during President Trump's first administration. He was actually arming Ukraine with weapons that they are now using in this proxy war. What I want to do now is lay out the precedents that exist demonstrating that the US has one continuous agenda, the encirclement and containment of Russia, part of a much larger geopolitical strategy to encircle and contain all peer and near-peer rivals, eliminate them, and maintain American primacy over the globe. And then I'm going to go over the actual evidence that this Trump administration, now in office, has absolutely no intention of genuinely pursuing peace with Russia. They are just buying time because they recognize the limits of American power. They need to focus on China first before circling back and dealing with Russia later. I wanted to go over all of that. There are new developments that have taken place since the last time I've gone over all of this, and I feel the need to repeat this because there are far too many people out there who are not listening or who have heard it but are refusing to face these facts. They are sidestepping these facts. So I believe it's important to continuously repeat this until more and more people are talking about this and forcing themselves to face it. I want to start all the way back at the end of the Cold War. And I have this National Security Archive by George Washington University, and it says NATO expansion, what Gorbachev heard. And it says, U.S. Secretary of State James Baker's famous not 1 inch eastward assurance about NATO expansion in his meeting with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev on February 9, 1990 was part of a cascade of assurances about Soviet security given by Western leaders to Gorbachev and other Soviet officials throughout the process of German reunification in 1990 and on into 1991, according to declassified U.S., Soviet, German, British, and French documents posted today by the National Security Archive at George Washington University. And the link to this will be in the video description below. And you could go through all of these documents if you doubt it for any reason. The documents show that multiple national leaders were considering and rejecting Central and Eastern European membership in NATO as early as 1990 and through 1991. That discussion of NATO in the context of German reunification negotiations in 1990 were not at all narrowly limited to the status of East German territory, and that subsequent Soviet and Russian complaints about being misled about NATO expansion were founded in written contemporaneous memocons and telecons at the highest levels. The documents reinforce former CIA Director Robert Gates' criticism of pressing ahead with expansion of NATO eastward in the 1990s when Gorbachev and others were led to believe that wouldn't happen. The key phrase buttressed by the documents is led to believe. A lie told by the United States and the rest of NATO to the nascent Russian Federation at the end of the Cold War about NATO expansion. We will not expand NATO. Just agree to this security architecture. Agree to it. Go along with it. You don't need to worry. Don't take measures to confront or attempt to counterbalance NATO. We're not going to expand eastward. Then, of course, they did. They were lying. They are always lying. They are acting in bad faith. They always have been. So right there, that is at the core of this entire conflict between the West and Russia. When President Putin talks about the core issues of the conflict in Ukraine, this is what he is talking about. And this is not being addressed by the current US administration. It has not been addressed by any administration before his. This has been a persistent threat to the Russian Federation. This is what it is reacting to through actions like the special military operation in Ukraine, which is unfolding as we speak right now. So that was 1990. Then we have 2004, The Guardian, US campaign behind the turmoil in Kiev. And so this is after the US, after NATO promised Russia it wouldn't expand eastward. Now they are overthrowing the governments of nations up to and along Russia's borders. They're installing hostile anti-Russian client regimes in power. They are transforming these nations into battering rams and aiming them at Russia itself. And that is exactly what this article talks all about. They're talking about the protests back in Ukraine in 2004, which ultimately failed, and then in 2014 restarted and succeeded in overthrowing the Ukrainian government and installing a hostile anti-Russian regime into Kiev. The campaign is an American creation, a sophisticated and brilliantly conceived exercise in Western branding and mass marketing that in 4 countries in 4 years have been used to try to salvage rigged elections and topple unsavory regimes. And all of this is just a euphemism for governments the US doesn't like. It was overthrowing them. They're obstructing America's geopolitical ambitions on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, and so they got rid of them through political interference, which is illegal under international law, a violation of the UN Charter in every conceivable way. And they're talking, these 4 countries in 4 years that they're talking about is Serbia, Ukraine, Georgia, which was successfully overthrown in 2003, and Belarus, which was a failure. And they talk specifically about Georgian leader Mikhail Saakashvili, who they helped install into power in Georgia in 2003. And then from 2003 to 2008, they did the exact same thing they did in Ukraine from 2014 onward. They began arming, training, equipping Georgian forces, transforming Georgia into a battering ram to use against Russia. And this is from 2005, so halfway through the process. U.S. forces helped Georgian army make big changes, and they're talking about eventually they changed out all of these Soviet-era rifles and began using US-made assault rifles. And they're talking about training and all the money that they were spending. And if you read this article, they're making it out as if the US is spending billions of dollars of building up Georgia's military so that it can help America in Iraq, as if Georgia was going to help the United States turn the tide in Iraq. It was all used as cover to create this battering ram that they were going to use against Russia. And then finally, in 2008, Georgia attacked Russian forces and precipitated a war between Russia and Georgia that Russia decisively won. And not only that, even though to this day you will hear the Western media claim Russia invaded Georgia, the EU itself conducted an investigation and they concluded that Georgia started war with Russia. EU-backed reports, and they talk about Mikhail Saakashvili, who the US installed into power in 2003, had said Georgia was responding to an invasion by Russian forces when it attacked breakaway South Ossetia, but the report found no evidence of this. So this is what the US did. They built up Georgia into a belligerent anti-Russian battering ram, and then they unleashed it in 2008. It was decisively defeated in what was a very short but devastating war for Georgia, and the United States found themselves in an impasse. And at that point, US-Russian relations were at their lowest point since the end of the Cold War. And that's not me saying that. That is this article right here saying that. And this was all happening under the Bush administration. Bush left office after 8 years. President Obama came into office. So Obama lands in Moscow with challenging agenda. US President Barack Obama says he wants to reset ties with Russia during a summit in Moscow, but he faces a host of challenges, including a new disarmament treaty and the thorny issue of Iran. If you just change US President Barack Obama with President Donald Trump, you could reuse this headline for today. This is literally the exact same thing playing over and over and over again. The same article also says, after Russia invaded Georgia last summer, relations with the US and the West sank to their lowest point since the Cold War. So that isn't me saying that. That is this article from France 24 saying that. And if you remember that period in time, that was the lowest point in US-Russian relations until President Barack Obama came into office, and they did what? They reset relations with Russia. And I know I've showed this video many times of US Secretary of State, then at that time Hillary Clinton, with a fake reset button, posing with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, talking about this reset. We have this article from Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, US government-funded media. After meeting Russian Foreign Minister, Clinton hails fresh starts. And so when I hear people talking about this diplomatic breakthrough by President Trump with Russia, I'm just thinking this is not a major breakthrough. This is not any sort of diplomatic revolution. This is a repeat of what has already happened in this repeating cycle of the US lying to Russia, violating its promises, reaching an impasse, and then posing as wanting peace to restart the whole cycle, buy time so they can restart the whole cycle. In this article regarding this reset between the US and Russia, it says, citing US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, "We think this is a fresh start, not only to improve our bilateral relationship, but to lead the world in important areas, particularly with respect to nuclear weapons and nuclear security," Clinton told a joint press conference with Lavrov after the two met in a luxury hotel in Geneva. Lavrov also expressed confidence that the two sides would make progress in arms control and on controversial US plans to deploy a missile defense system in Europe, one of the key flashpoints as relations deteriorated under former US President George Bush. So President Bush, during his 8 years in office, did not just create Georgia as a battering ram and unleash it against Russia. He also withdrew from a key arms control treaty with Russia and then began planning the deployment of weapons prohibited under that arms control treaty in Europe in a direct threat to Russia. There was this fake reset that the US used to buy time to finish that entire process and to restart the process of finding another proxy, Ukraine this time, overthrow the government and begin militarizing Ukraine, leading to exactly what we see taking place right now. So there was the 2014 overthrow of the Ukrainian government under the Obama administration. For 2014 onward, the US, again, made deals with Russia in bad faith to buy time for Ukrainian armed forces they were trying to build up. Separatists in eastern Ukraine were badly defeating them. They were encircling them. The Ukrainian armed forces were facing complete annihilation. And so there were the Minsk agreements meant to buy time to save the Ukrainian armed forces so the US could continue building them out ahead of this much larger proxy war they had in mind. Articles like this: Angela Merkel duped by Russian pranksters pretending to be Ukraine's Poroshenko. But in this article, they admit the truth about the Minsk agreements, that it was used to buy time. Merkel insisted that her stance on the Minsk agreement, which brought a ceasefire after Russia's 2014 annexation of Ukraine's Crimea Peninsula, had been right. Key points of the Minsk peace talks, including disarmament and supervision by an international body, were never followed through. But Merkel said the agreement had nonetheless helped buy Kiev time to arm itself better against the Russian military. So it was just a ploy to buy time to rearm Ukraine's armed forces for this much larger proxy war the US always had in mind. And Germany played a party to that. President Donald Trump himself played a party to that. So let's talk about President Donald Trump himself, specifically during his first term in office. He has a history of unilaterally withdrawing from agreements with other nations based on fabricated claims. We have this. From 2018, President Donald J. Trump is ending United States participation in an unacceptable Iran deal. No evidence was ever presented to substantiate this claim that it was somehow unacceptable. It was a predictable betrayal of Iran, just as the US has repeatedly made agreements with Russia and then betrayed them. All meant to both buy time for the United States, but also undermine the credibility of these nations the US is targeting and attempting to undermine, divide, destroy, and overthrow the governments of. What about Russia specifically? I just talked to you about the Bush administration leaving an arms control treaty specifically so the US could begin encircling Russia with missile systems that directly threatened Russia itself. Well, President Trump continued this. President Donald J. Trump to withdraw the United States from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the INF Treaty. This was 2019. Russia has not, unfortunately, honored the agreement, so we're going to terminate the agreement. We're going to pull out. Was there any evidence provided to substantiate that claim? The answer is no. And as a matter of fact, as soon as the US began pulling out of that treaty, they began developing, or at least publicly announcing that they were developing missiles that they would then deploy to Europe under the following Biden administration. So you can see that this isn't just the US and Europe in general making agreements with Russia, posing as wanting peace with Russia, and then undermining those overtures of peace through continued aggression and encroachment. President Donald Trump himself has participated in this. And I would say the worst offense of all was his administration during his first term in office beginning to openly, publicly, and enthusiastically arm Ukrainian forces. Trump administration approves new sale of anti-tank weapons to Ukraine. The Trump administration first approved the sale of javelins to Ukraine in 2017. So this was 2017 to 2019. And this is almost certainly the last red line crossed from Russia's point of view, compelling it to launch the special military operation. Because if Ukraine continued receiving Western weapons, Western training, its military being built up larger and larger, considering what the US already did to Russia through this same process with Georgia, a much smaller nation, if they didn't act first, Ukraine could turn into a national security threat Russia might not have been able to handle later on. They had to deal with it sooner rather than later. This establishes an irrefutable precedent that the US is not actually seeking peace with Russia, or any other nation for that matter. When they propose these peace deals, it is almost always to buy time after reaching a certain impasse so they can reorganize and restart hostilities at a later time when factors tilt better in their favor. In the case of Iran, the Brookings Institution in its Which Path to Persia report in 2009 openly said that making a deal with Iran, like the nuclear deal, at that time it wasn't publicly announced yet, would be valuable to demonstrate the US as being interested in diplomacy and giving Iran a chance, and then sabotaging the agreement themselves to make it out as if Iran was being unreasonable and that only force was the only option left. So these are the two reasons the US does this. And this is according to US policymakers themselves. Now let's go over the actual specific evidence regarding the Trump administration itself. Now I know I have done this already, but I need to continue to do this because far too many people continue to ignore this. So I want to go over US Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth at the Ukraine Defense Contact Group, February 12, 2025, in Brussels, and he is going to break down the entire plan. And the plan is not to make peace with Russia. It is to freeze the conflict so the US can pivot to China, deal with China, and then pivot back to Russia at a later date. That is the plan. And he laid it out step by step. He told Europe exactly what to do. Let's listen.
A durable peace for Ukraine must include robust security guarantees to ensure that the war will not begin again. This must not be Minsk 3.0. That said, the United States does not believe that NATO membership for Ukraine is a realistic outcome of a negotiated settlement. Instead, any security guarantee must be backed by capable European and non-European troops. If these troops are deployed as peacekeepers to Ukraine at any point, they should be deployed as part of a non-NATO mission, and they should not be covered under Article 5. There also must be robust international oversight of the line of contact. To be clear, as part of any security guarantee, there will not be U.S. troops deployed to Ukraine. To further enable effective diplomacy and drive down energy prices that fund the Russian war machine, President Trump is unleashing American energy production and encouraging other nations to do the same. Lower energy prices, coupled with more effective enforcement of energy sanctions, will help bring Russia to the table. Safeguarding European security must be an imperative for European members of NATO. As part of this, Europe must provide the overwhelming share of future lethal and non-lethal aid to Ukraine. Members of this contact group must meet the moment. This means donating more ammunition and equipment, leveraging comparative advantages, expanding your defense industrial base, and importantly, leveling with your citizens about the threat facing Europe. Part of this is speaking frankly with your people about how this threat can only be met by spending more on defense. 2% is not enough. President Trump has called for 5%, and I agree. We're also here today to directly and unambiguously express that stark strategic realities prevent the United States of America from being primarily focused on the security of Europe. We also face a peer competitor in the communist Chinese, with the capability and intent to threaten our homeland and core national interests in the Indo-Pacific. The U.S. is prioritizing deterring war with China in the Pacific, recognizing the reality of scarcity and making the resourcing trade-offs to ensure deterrence does not fail. As the United States prioritizes its attention to these threats, European allies must lead from the front. Together, we can establish a division of labor that maximizes our comparative advantages in Europe and Pacific, respectively. These are first steps. More must still be done. We ask each of your countries to step up on fulfilling the commitments that you have made. And we challenge your countries and your citizens to double down and recommit yourselves not only to Ukraine's immediate security needs, but to Europe's long-term defense and deterrence goals.
And then from that day forward, Europe fully complied to every single point laid out by U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth. Secretary Hegseth told Europe to donate more ammunition and equipment to Ukraine. He told them to begin expanding their defense industrial base. And this is exactly what the nations in Europe began doing. Germany set to spend big on army and infrastructure. We're talking hundreds of billions of euros to do this. You had Ursula von der Leyen, EU chief, unveils 800 billion euro plan to rearm Europe. She says, we are ready to step up.
We ask each of your countries to step up on fulfilling the commitments that you have made.
That is literally the phrase Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth used while giving his directives on February 12th in Brussels. We have Emmanuel Macron, President of France. Macron turns the screws on ministers to boost defense spending. Okay, and this was all in the aftermath of Secretary Hegseth's directive. And of course, the most damning of all was this. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth greets the United Kingdom's Secretary of State for Defense, John Healey, and takes questions from the press. And this is when the UK Secretary of State for Defense, John Healey, said this right across the table from US Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth.
We last met last month in NATO, and then you challenged Europe to step up. You challenged us to step up on Ukraine, on defense spending, on European security, and I say to you that we have, we are, and we will further. And last week, the British Prime Minister announced the biggest increase in defense spending since the end of the Cold War, and we will go further.
Secretary Hegseth told them to do it, and he is publicly acknowledging that they obeyed him. They heard the directive and they answered it. And now we have the UK and France preparing exactly what US Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth laid out in his February 12th directive.
Any security guarantee must be backed by capable European and non-European troops. They should be deployed as part of a non-NATO mission, and they should not be covered under Article 5.
They need to be part of a non-NATO mission, and they should not be covered under Article 5 because this absolves the US from having to get involved directly. They used Ukraine down to the last Ukrainian. They're running out of Ukrainians. They're now getting the Europeans ready to be fed into the proxy war next. The whole point of a proxy war is to have others fighting it for you, to absorb all of the negative consequences of it while you yourself enjoy all of the benefits of it. And as Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth laid out on February 12th, the US needs to pivot to China. They cannot be tied up in Ukraine. This is something Europe needs to do. And I hear a lot of people making the counter argument, Europe doesn't have the troops, they don't have the military equipment, they don't have the ability to fight and defeat Russia. That's not the point. Ukraine didn't have the manpower or the equipment to ever defeat Russia. It wasn't about defeating Russia, it was about overextending Russia. And that is all they need Europe to do. They need Europe to overextend Russia one way or the other by creating a national security threat. Russia needs to keep tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of troops tied up in and around Ukraine, dealing with or actually fighting a hot war with NATO nations. So this is British Prime Minister Keir Starmer talking about sending these troops into Ukraine, just as Secretary Hegseth told him to.
Sooner or later, Putin will have to come to the table. So this is the moment that the guns fall silent, that the barbaric attacks on Ukraine once and for all stop, and agree to a ceasefire now. That is why now is the time to engage in discussion on a mechanism to manage and monitor a full ceasefire, and agree to serious negotiations towards not just a pause, but a lasting peace, backed by strong security arrangements through our coalition of the willing. And we won't sit back and wait for Putin to act. Instead, we will keep pushing forward. So the group I convened today is more important than ever. It brings together partners from across Europe, as well as Canada, Australia and New Zealand, with backing from others too, including Japan. We agreed we will keep increasing the pressure on Russia, keep the military aid flowing to Ukraine, and keep tightening restrictions on Russia's economy to weaken Putin's war machine and bring him to the table. And we agreed to accelerate our practical work to support a potential deal. So we will now move into an operational phase. Our militaries will meet on Thursday this week here in the United Kingdom to put strong and robust plans in place to swing in behind a peace deal and guarantee Ukraine's future security.
And just to be clear, what Prime Minister Keir Starmer is talking about is sending troops into Ukraine to provide those security guarantees. And we know that because of articles like this from Reuters. UK says a significant number of nations ready to provide troops for Ukraine peace. That is what he was talking about in his speech. Then there's articles like this. Macron says Russia's permission not needed to deploy troops in Ukraine. And in this article, it specifically talks about a few thousand troops from each state deployed at key points in Ukraine to conduct training programs and show our long-term support. Macron said in an interview that proposed contingents from countries that were members of the NATO alliance. They would serve as a guarantee of security, almost the exact wording of Secretary Hegseth.
Any security guarantee must be backed by capable European and non-European troops.
And it also says for Ukraine, and that several European nations and also non-European nations, again, the almost the exact wording used by Secretary Hegseth, have expressed their willingness to join such an effort when it is confirmed. Under no circumstances can the Ukrainians make territorial concessions without having any security guarantees. So again, what Secretary Hegseth laid out was a Minsk III framework to freeze the conflict and then create a Syria-style buffer zone inside Ukraine using European and non-European troops, not American troops, because it's a proxy war. They don't want to get involved directly. They need to pivot to China. And people keep forgetting that when the US says they want a ceasefire in Ukraine so they can pivot to China, it's not because the US seeks peace and stability around the globe. It is because they realize, and Secretary Hegseth said this himself,
the U.S. is prioritizing deterring war with China in the Pacific, recognizing the reality of scarcity.
They are recognizing the reality of scarcity They cannot be in two places at one time. And they are trying to establish a division of labor between themselves, confronting China in Asia, in the exact same type of conflict they have provoked with Russia in Europe. And they want Europe to at least freeze the conflict, this confrontation with Russia, until the US has the ability to circle back and finish the job. While the US poses as wanting to end hostilities to achieve some sort of lasting peace, it is clear it's doing anything but that. Has an established history of posing as wanting peace while simply stalling for time to restart hostilities on terms tilted better in their favor. And that is exactly what the Trump administration is doing right now. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth laid it out openly in Brussels, a directive he gave to Europe that Europe is now implementing fully. The United States is talking about expanding NATO funding, NATO being the core issue that Russia itself recognizes as the cause of this entire conflict. Expanding US, European, and non-European military industrial output, expanding arms and ammunition shipments and other forms of support to Ukraine itself. Maybe the US cutting back on it, but not even really, but encouraging Europe to double down on it. Secretary Hegseth literally said double down on Europe's support for Ukraine.
And we challenge your countries and your citizens to double down and recommit yourselves not only to Ukraine's immediate security needs, but to Europe's long-term defense and deterrence goals.
And this creation of either a buffer zone or a tripwire force comprised of European and non-European armed forces within Ukrainian territory. This is meant to prevent Russia from restarting hostilities against Ukraine when all of this obviously falls apart and it becomes clear that the US has duped Russia again, yet again. And again, it's worth repeating that the whole reason the US is stalling for time and pretending to be interested in peace with Russia over Ukraine is because they admit they need to pivot to Asia Pacific and confront China in a conflict exactly the same as the conflict they have provoked with Russia in Ukraine. And this demonstrates that there is absolutely no desire at all to pursue peace over primacy, and that all it is a pragmatic recognition of America's limits, the limits to its power at this juncture, and the need to reorganize their pursuit of primacy as the Trump administration commences bombing Yemen, as they enabled Israel to violate its ceasefire with the Palestinians, and is now dropping the 2,000-pound bombs the Trump administration eagerly supplied to Israel, as the US threatens war with Iran. If you are still not convinced that the US in general and the Trump administration specifically have no interest at all in actual peace, I don't know what else to tell you. I will continue making this argument and incorporating new information as it emerges. For those who are listening and do appreciate this message, please like and share this video. Please check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. In the video description below are all of the links that I referenced in this video, as well as for ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize my YouTube channel or any of my other social media platforms. If ads pop up, feel free to skip them. They're not helping me out at all. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also through Patreon. To everyone who has been helping out, whether it's a one-time donation, donations month to month, or if you have no resources to spare and you're just sharing my work with others, that is all greatly appreciated. That is what makes this work possible. So thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.